First Lieutenant Casey Morales sat quietly at the end of the long folding table, her back straight and her hands folded over the checklist she had already run through twice. The air in the briefing tent was thick with sweat and dust, carrying the constant drone of turbines spinning somewhere beyond the canvas walls. Heat shimmer pressed down from above, and every breath tasted faintly of rusted steel and dry sand. Around her, voices rose and fell in confident bursts, the other pilots tossing jokes across the room as if the mission ahead were another round in a game they had already mastered. She kept her helmet visor at her side, the dark glass catching the glint of the bare bulb overhead, but she said nothing. Her call sign, Jinx, had been scribbled in faded ink across the roster pinned to the board at the front of the tent. Someone had half erased it and written a sharp note beside it backup. The word sat there like an afterthought. Casey noticed it the way she noticed everything. Quietly, carefully, and without protest. She had learned in training that speaking up only gave them more to throw back at her. The nickname had started as a joke, a reminder of every unlucky engine stall, every cut sortie, every failed sim that had not even been her fault. She had carried it because there was no other choice, and she carried it now with the same quiet discipline. The commanding officer spoke through the chatter, laying out the operation with the clipped rhythm of routine. Strike Group Alpha would cut into the heart of the zone, supporting armor pushing deep into contested ground. Bravo Flight would take the central approach, diving straight into the kill box. Morales was marked for the perimeter. Outer ring patrol. Watch the skies, hold the line, and stay clear. In other words, back up. The pilots around her exchanged grins and half-muttered comments. Figures, one said, leaning back in his chair. Keep Jinx out where she can't do much harm. Another laughed, adding something about lucky charms and bad dice. The sound rolled across the table in waves, easy, careless, and sure of itself. Casey lowered her eyes to her folded checklist, thumb smoothing over the creased edge. The paper was smudged from repeated use. The ink faded where her glove had pressed too often, but it was hers. A small ritual. A steady reminder of preparation when respect was scarce. She absorbed the noise without answering. The habit of silence was not weakness, but armor, a way of listening more than she spoke. It gave her room to breathe, room to measure, room to notice the details that others dismissed. The periphery. They called it Marnie. But she could already see the advantage. From the outer ring, she would hold the widest view. She would see what they could not from the center. No one believed that mattered. But she tucked the thought away, like a secret. The briefing broke up in the usual scrape of chairs and the flap of the tent door, heat rushing in as they filed out toward the tarmac. Casey followed last, her boots crunching over sand, the dry wind pushing grit against her flight suit. Out on the line. The A-10s waited like beasts crouched in the heat haze, their paint scorched and chipped, their massive cannons slung beneath them like jaws. She paused a moment, her gaze resting on the battered nose of her aircraft. Old, tough, scarred. Built, not for show, but for survival. In the fading light, the jet looked less like backup and more like a sentinel. Casey slid her folded checklist into her sleeve pocket, the crease pressing against her arm like a reminder. She climbed the ladder without speaking, visor catching the last flare of the desert sun. Around her, the others still laughed and shouted, confident in their assignments. She moved with the same calm rhythm she always did, unhurried, precise. They thought she was sidelined. She knew better. From the edges, you could see everything. The pre-flight checks came as naturally to Casey Morales as breathing. She moved through each switch and dial with the calm rhythm of ritual, her gloved fingertips brushing controls worn smooth by years of other hands. She called out each confirmation softly to herself, the words steady and deliberate. Outside. The heat shimmer bent the air above the runway, blurring the line where the desert met the sky. The noise of turbines rolled across the flight line in waves, a mechanical heartbeat that rattled her chest. Around her, other pilots joked with their crew chiefs, slapping shoulders, trading grins as if the sortie were another exercise. Casey kept her head down, visor tilted low, focused only on her machine. The warthog beneath her was no stranger to scars. Paint blistered on its panels, bolts darkened from years of strain. A faint burn mark streaked across the fuselage like a memory of fire. To Casey, it was more than a machine. The A-10 was an old ally, weathered but unbroken, built to take punishment and give it back tenfold. Its thick wings caught the sunlight in heavy arcs, casting broad shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement. The great cannon slung beneath its nose seemed to anchor it to the earth, a promise of both destruction and protection. Sitting in the cockpit, Casey felt steadier than she had in weeks. The checklist pressed into her sleeve pocket reminded her of the order she carried inside the chaos. Engines roared louder as the first jet in line powered forward, heat washing back across the tarmac, one after another. The warthogs thundered into the sky, their heavy frames pulling free of gravity with reluctant grace. Casey waited her turn, last in the line. She watched each plane climb, their wings flashing against the desert glare, their voices quick and confident over the radio. When her signal came, she pushed forward, the cockpit vibrating with the deep growl of turbines spooling. The aircraft shuddered, then rolled, wheels pounding once before they lifted from the earth. Her seat pressed against her back, and she felt the sudden drop of silence as the runway fell away beneath her. The desert stretched wide and empty as she climbed into her assigned orbit. Heat shimmer blurred the ridgelines, turning stone into shifting waves. From above, she could see convoy trails cut across the sand in thin gray lines, dust rising where trucks crawled forward below. The strike package was already peeling inward, diving aggressively toward the kill box, their comms alive with chatter and target calls. Casey eased into her wide arc, alone in the outer ring. The silence pressed in, heavy but clean. Out here she felt invisible, yet she also saw farther than anyone else. Her warthog rumbled steady, scarred metal creaking like old bones but holding firm. She steadied her breathing and held the orbit, unseen at the edges, already sensing that the periphery might carry its own kind of power. Casey held her orbit wide and steady, the desert stretching endless beneath her wings. The air shimmered with heat rising from the ridgelines, the ground below shifting in mirage. Her instruments glowed dimly against the light, fuel gauge already dipping lower than she liked, digits flickering at the edge of warning. She adjusted trim with 2 fingers, each movement measured, careful, as though she were tuning the silence itself. The cockpit hummed around her, a low vibration carried through metal and bone, steady and alive. The radio crackled with voices that filled the air with a rhythm she did not share. Laughter spilled over the net, pilots tossing lines back and forth as if the kill box ahead were already won. One voice joked about what the chow hall might serve tonight. Another claimed he could smell burned coffee from 20 miles out. They spoke in bursts of bravado, confident in their roles, confident that the battle belonged to them. Casey said nothing. Her own breathing filled the headset, slow and even. A reminder that she existed at the edge, but not in their circle. She checked her kneeboard, neat notes written in careful block letters, markers color-coded for quick reference. None of the others would ever see them. No one had asked for her prep work, and she had stopped offering. The periphery was hers alone, drawn out in orbit lines across her maps. Out here she felt suspended between usefulness and irrelevance, her aircraft circling above a battle that might not even need her. She could see the convoy trails stretching faintly across the sand, dust plumes rising like smoke, but she remained unseen herself. Turbulence jolted her frame briefly, the jet dipping before she corrected. Through the canopy, thin clouds were beginning to stretch in streaks across the high sky. She noticed the change without comment, a flicker of instability that might grow later. The others kept talking, voices loud with certainty, blind to anything beyond their immediate path into the kill box. She shifted in her seat, hand brushing the edge of the fuel gauge again, the flicker steadying for now, but reminding her of limits. The isolation pressed harder as the minutes stretched. She wondered if she truly mattered in this orbit, or if her assignment had been designed to keep her out of the way. Her call sign returned to her mind. Jinx. A word spoken often enough to carry weight, even when no one said it aloud. She breathed once, long and even, and told herself that silence was not weakness. Silence meant she was watching, and watching meant she would be the first to see what others missed. She banked gently, wings cutting against the sun glare, and let her gaze drift over the wide stretch of desert. Beneath her, everything moved, trucks dragging lines of dust, shadows lengthening as the day wore thin. No one else noticed, but she did. And in that quiet, the thought settled into her chest like an iron truth if something happened out here. No one else was coming. It would be her alone. The first burst of static made Casey reach instinctively for the volume knob, expecting another joke or target call from the strike package. Instead, a fractured voice pushed through, raw and desperate. Any station, this is Hammer 2, taking heavy fire at grid. The transmission broke into chaos, drowned in shouts and the hammering thud of automatic weapons. She caught fragments, coordinates blurred by gunfire, a strained plea for immediate support. Another voice cut in, higher, panicked, before dissolving in static. Her stomach tightened. This was not banter. This was survival. She pressed her headset tighter against her ear, tuning out the background noise of her own engines. The sound returned, clearer for a moment. 2 armored vehicles, closing fast. We've got wounded. We're cut off any air. Respond. The words snapped into her bloodstream. She pictured the ridgeline below, dust trails forming at the edges of the zone, a platoon caught exposed with steel bearing down. She flicked her eyes to the comms panel. Silence. None of the other flights answered. The net remained filled with distant chatter from the strike group, still locked deep inside the kill box. No one acknowledged the grid call. She felt the isolation close in. Her orbit suddenly transformed from empty routine into the only line left. She keyed her mic, voice low. Hammer 2. Say again, coordinates. The reply came jagged, rushed between bursts of gunfire. Numbers, bearings, a landmark she could see from her canopy. It lined up perfectly with her outer ring. She was already above them. She looked to the fuel gauge, the numbers dipping toward caution, and then to the horizon, where heat shimmer bent the desert into waves. She was here. No one else was. Her call sign flashed on the HUD as if mocking her jinx. The name had followed her from training, a reminder of mishaps and bad luck. Now it hung there, luminous and sharp. She stared at it, teeth set, backup, spare, invisible. Yet in this moment, the word meant nothing. The squad pinned below did not care about her past. They needed steel in the sky. She wrapped her hand around the throttle, felt the tremor in her wrist, and pressed it down until the engines roared harder. The radio still held silence from the others. She imagined them hearing the call, calculating distance, knowing they could not reach it in time. Her breath came steady, deliberate. Hammer 2. This is Warthog. I've got you. The words left her mouth with a weight she had not expected, steady despite the pounding in her chest. She knew what it meant: no orders, no backup, no certainty. Only her. Through the canopy, she spotted movement near the convoy trail. Dust lifted in broad arcs where tanks rolled forward, dark shapes crawling toward the trapped infantry. The image locked in her vision, sharp and undeniable. Her orbit had placed her in perfect position. The so-called periphery, now the center of everything. She eased the stick forward, nose dipping, altitude bleeding away. Her hands steadied on controls that had carried countless others before her. The stick was warm under her palm, the throttle pushing against her grip like a living thing. For a heartbeat, she thought about how thin the line was between being forgotten and becoming everything. Then, she forced the thought down, muscle memory taking over. "It's just me," she whispered, the words swallowed by the roar of her engines. Alone above the desert, with a platoon waiting for her, she chose without hesitation. She would act. Casey shoved the nose of the Warthog down, the horizon tilting as the desert rushed upward to meet her. The aircraft groaned under the sudden dive, metal straining with a sound she had only heard in simulators. Wind roared along the canopy, and the ridgelines below sharpened into focus, jagged against the haze. Ahead, the dark silhouette of the enemy tank crawled forward, its barrel beginning to swing toward the pinned platoon. Her pulse hammered in rhythm with the throttle as she pushed it harder. The radio filled with frantic voices. Coordinates shouted over the crash of small arms fire. Her thumb pressed the master arm switch, a movement practiced countless times but never before in true combat. The GAU-8 Avenger spun up with a mechanical growl that rolled through the frame of the jet, a thunder that lived in its bones. She felt it rattle up through her seat, into her chest, as if the aircraft itself was waking. The sound cut through everything static, gunfire, even her own fear. For a moment, nothing else existed. She lined the tank in her sight, wings trembling in the hot updraft. The ground filled the canopy, sand streaked with dark trails, flashes of fire and muzzle bursts scattered across the terrain. She breathed out, slow and steady, and squeezed. The Avenger roared. The cannon's recoil shook the cockpit, brass casings clattering away in streams, smoke curling across the nose. A river of rounds tore across the desert and ripped into the tank just as its gun flared to life. The vehicle erupted in fire. Turret wrenched sideways, smoke jetting upward in a violent plume. The radio caught a single cheer, ragged but real, from one of the infantry. Another voice cracked with relief. "You got it. You got it." The sound carried more weight than any metal, and Casey clenched her jaw to hold her composure. Her reply came even, stripped of emotion. "Chatigi." First target neutralized. Stay low. She masked the tremor in her chest, the wild rush that surged beneath the calm. But the ground was already answering. Tracers clawed upward in orange streaks, the air alive with lines of fire. A surface-to-air missile streaked from the far ridge, curling smoke in her peripheral vision. She pulled hard, the jet howling in protest as she dove lower, so close that her wings cut shimmering lines through the heat just above the sand. Dust exploded upward in sheets, trailing her like a storm as she banked hard. The belly of the aircraft rattled with fragments, pebbles and grit slamming against steel. Her training returned in sharp fragments angles, countermeasures, evasive rolls. She fired flares and watched them burst in streaks of light, the missile biting one and detonating harmlessly behind her. She leveled out only meters above the desert. The ground blurred into a rushing smear beneath her. The Warthog's thick frame absorbed every jolt, stubborn and unyielding. In that instant, she felt the machine's design in her bones, built not for speed, not for grace, but to endure and strike when it mattered most. Her breath steadied again, visor fogging slightly at the edges. The echoes of the cannon still rang in her ears, even though the sky had gone silent except for her engines. For the first time she knew what it meant to be inside, the moment the aircraft was made for, where all the hours of dismissal and silence collapsed into one truth. The spare part had become the point of the spear. The desert below shifted again, and Casey caught sight of the second tank breaking off, its tracks carving a wide path through the sand. It was circling toward the flank of the pinned infantry, moving with slow confidence, barrel lifting to cut the platoon down where their cover thinned. Her breath tightened. She had bought them seconds with the first strike, but the fight was not done. She pulled the Warthog into a wide arc, engines grinding, wings tilting against the bright horizon. The maneuver bled precious fuel, and her gauge dipped toward the red. A warning light flickered, steady and insistent, but she ignored it. The radio filled with frantic voices from the ground, coordinates spilling out, panic rising as the second tank advanced. She steadied her hands on the stick, feeling the shiver in her gloves, and banked back toward the target. The jet rattled as tracers lit the sky again, orange streams clawing upward to drag her down. She leveled, nose locked on the lumbering shadow below, the Avenger humming like a storm coiled in steel. The desert floor rushed up as she dove, the canopy vibrating under the sudden acceleration. Ground fire hammered her frame, shuddering impacts rattling the cockpit. Warning tones screamed in her headset, lights flashing amber across her panel. She grit her teeth, holding the dive. Dust tore upward in plumes as her wings sliced the shimmer. At the last instant, she pressed the trigger. The Gaiu-8 thundered, the cannon's recoil shaking her body in the harness. A torrent of rounds ripped into the second tank, tearing through armor with a roar that drowned even the gunfire below. A moment of stillness followed. Then the vehicle erupted in a brutal chain reaction. Ammunition inside cooked off in white bursts. Turret wrenched skyward, flames rolling out in a wave. Smoke poured upward, black and heavy, curling across the desert wind. The relief in the infantry's voices hit her ears like a flood. Someone shouted through static, "Both tanks down. We're clear." Another broke in, breathless. "God bless that hog." Their voices shook with disbelief, and for a moment she let herself feel it, the faint cheer of men alive, because she had chosen to dive. But the fight was not finished. A new warning shrieked in her headset. She glimpsed a streak of smoke carving toward her, a missile locking fast. Instinct surged. She slammed the stick forward, forcing the jet lower than she had ever dared. The desert floor filled her vision, rushing by in blurred streaks of rock and sand. She skimmed so close that her shadow ran like a twin beneath her, wing edges slicing the haze. Dust exploded upward, coating the fuselage in a storm of grit. The missile streaked past, fooled by her flares, and detonated harmlessly behind her. The shockwave slapped her jet, panels rattling, warning lights blinking angrily, but the hog held. She steadied her breathing, muscles trembling, as the smoke trail curled away into nothing. The aircraft was battered, dust-caked, but alive like her. The comms went quiet. For a long moment there was only the sound of her engines and the distant crackle of flames below. Then the infantry leader's voice cut through, low and steady, carrying the weight of survival. "Hammer 2 secure. We owe you everything." Silence followed, not from neglect this time, but from awe. In the stillness, Casey realized the battle was over. The periphery had saved the center. She tightened her grip on the stick, heart hammering with both fear and fierce relief. She had survived, and so had they. Casey eased the Warthog into a wide, deliberate circle, engines humming low as the battlefield spread quiet beneath her. The desert was no longer alive with tracers and fire, but with smoke drifting upward in black columns. The wreckage of the two tanks smoldered, their twisted shapes marking the ground in brutal permanence. Dust still hung thick in the air, reluctant to settle, as if the land itself resisted silence. She scanned the ridgelines, eyes flicking between gauges and the horizon, searching for any movement that might signal a hidden threat. Nothing stirred but the faint shimmer of heat and the slow crawl of infantry vehicles moving again, tentative but alive. Inside the cockpit, the glow of warning lights painted her in steady red. The fuel gauge blinked in rhythm, sharp and insistent, a reminder that her time above the field was limited. She acknowledged it without panic, adjusting her orbit to conserve what little remained. Down below. Hammer. 2 confirmed over the radio that they were regrouping, wounded, secured, perimeter stable. Their leader's voice carried exhaustion and quiet gratitude. Not a cheer this time, but something deeper. Survival. Voiced. Plain. Only then did other A-10s return on the comms, voices breaking the net with stilted congratulations. The words were hesitant, almost reluctant, as if they struggled to fit what had happened into the order they had expected. "Nice work, Jinx," one said after a pause, the call sign landing with awkward weight. Another muttered, "Didn't think you were that close." The belated praise rang hollow. Too late to matter. She answered none of it, her focus still on the ground. Her orbit held steady until the last armored vehicle began to roll again, dust curling behind it like a fragile lifeline. Only then did she let herself exhale, her visor fogging faintly as she drew in slow air. She was not thinking of medals or logs. She was thinking of the men who would walk away from this fight because she had been in the sky when no one else was. Out on the periphery, she had been the lifeline. Backup no longer. The runway shimmered in fading heat as Casey guided the Warthog down, the aircraft rattling as if reluctant to return to Earth. Her hands trembled on the stick. Small quivers she forced into stillness while the tires screamed against the pavement. The engines spooled down, their roar falling into a tired hum, leaving only the whistle of cooling metal. She taxied to her slot, every movement deliberate, breath slow as though the rhythm might steady her heart. When the canopy lifted, the desert evening washed over her, cooler now but carrying the weight of fuel and dust. She pulled the helmet off, sweat matting her hair against her temples, and held it in both hands. The plastic felt heavier than it ever had, as though it contained all the weight of the last hour. A crew chief clambered up the ladder, his eyes running across the fuselage. He reached out and swiped a hand over the intake, bringing it back streaked in grit. Burn marks slashed across the metal, black and jagged, and he whistled under his breath. Nearby, the other pilots stood clustered, voices low, eyes sliding toward her but never holding. One muttered, "Hell of a thing," and left it there, unable to bridge the silence that followed. They shifted, uneasy, their confidence from the briefing tent now dimmed into something else. Beyond them, leaning against a transport truck, the platoon she had saved waited, faces lined with fatigue, uniforms torn. They met her eyes without words. A single nod passed from their leader, a gesture small but unshakable, carrying more weight than any decoration. Casey dipped her chin in return, the acknowledgement enough. She climbed down at last, boots settling on the pavement. Dust streaked the Warthog behind her, a scarred witness to what had been done. She did not smile, did not claim triumph. She accepted the silence, helmet still in her trembling hands, and let the recognition remain unspoken. The debrief ended without fanfare. Casey's sortie was logged as peripheral support, the line tucked between routine entries. No mention of tanks destroyed, no record of lives pulled back from the edge. On paper, it was a mission like any other, another patrol that had kept orbit without incident. The ink dried quickly, reducing the chaos of the day into a forgettable phrase. But the base itself told a different story. In the corridors and on the flight line, voices murmured in low tones. Crew chiefs traded glances. Infantrymen leaned against trucks and whispered to one another. They did not speak her name loudly, but the meaning was there, carried in the way they said it. The backup who had answered when no one else could. The word Jinx, once used as a casual jab at her mistakes in training, began to shift. Now it was spoken quietly, almost carefully, as if it had become a title rather than an insult. Later, the hangar was nearly empty, shadows stretching long across the concrete. Casey stood alone beside her Warthog, the metal still warm from the day, dust and scorch marks clinging to its skin. She rested her hand against the fuselage, fingers tracing the roughened surface. The aircraft had held together, stubborn and unyielding, built for survival in the very moment it had been needed most. She leaned in close, whispering a simple word of thanks meant only for the machine. Her voice barely carried in the cavernous dark, but it did not need to. The roar of the Gu-8 had spoken louder than anything she could say, a sound already etched into memory. On the periphery, a legend had begun not in records, but in whispers.